All right, welcome back, everybody. We're going to begin our final panel of the day, which will draw on from the previous 4 panel discussions to identify cross-cutting themes and potential best practices for both local transmission facilities and regional reliability, transmission planning, and cost management, in addition to innovative approaches that could be explored further, including the possibility of establishing a role for an independent transmission monitor to the extent consistent with the Commission's authority and mechanisms to support enhanced transparency. Given the length of panel 5, I think it's safe to say we'll take a quick 5-minute stretch break at, let's say, 4 o'clock. And per earlier panels, turn it up. Remember to turn your mic on. And without further ado, Commissioner Clements.
Thank you, John. And it's nice to see all of you. What an all-star panel we have to end with. Thank you for hanging in there today. I'm going to sneak out before the closing comments for my daughter's appointment, but it's not because I don't care what the last things that get said by my colleagues are. Okay. I'm going to start with, a question for Chair Bartlett and for Mr. Dennis. In your comments, you both wrote about potential revisions to the way our formula rate processes work, or else our prudence standards, our approach to ROEs that may change the financial incentive relative to transmission investment towards more cost-effective outcomes. That assumes that there is a need for that. So maybe starting with the premise of our existing formula rate processes sufficient in the prudence standard, and then would you recommend any specific changes to them?
Thank you. Thank you for the question. Phil Bartlett, Chair of the Maine Public Utilities Commission. I think the challenge that we have is that there's this huge regulatory gap we know about, at least with the asset condition projects, where there is no CPCN process they're going through. So there really is never an opportunity to challenge prudence at any level, although I even think the CPCN process is not adequate for establishing prudence. But nonetheless, they're just going into the rates. So to me, if there is no kind of review of that kind, then perhaps a lower ROE would be appropriate. Perhaps a different standard, having the utilities come in and justify that these are just and reasonable expenses for those investments would be another way to think about it. Otherwise, when we get into the ITM discussion, the question is whether that would create a pathway with information that would allow you to provide more scrutiny. And I think you'd want to pair that with some changes to the formulary process and start shifting more of the burden back to the utilities that they have gone through some kind of cost scrutiny as part of the planning, whether that's a regional or local planning.
Thanks. I agree with a lot of what Chair Bartlett said. Our members have told us that, even sophisticated members of our organization, folks who are large developers of renewable energy, big transmission customers, have told us that it's very difficult for them to review formula rate filings and to pursue the challenge processes that are there. And I think a lot of what we've talked about today is a matter of transparency. And I think even before we get to thinking about some of the reforms, the first thing we have to do is think about transparency. Mr. Gastiger mentioned kind of the layers of review that he sees with regard to formula rates, like the challenge procedures and things like that. None of those things work if customers don't have transparency into what's in those rates. And equally importantly, what the standard of review is to challenge them, to Mr. Bartlett's, I think what he was talking about, or Chair Bartlett's point about the standard of review that's applied. So I think those things are important. One thing that I think is really interesting to consider, and I frankly stole this from Chairman Chandler's earlier comments in the NOPR proceeding, is to think about categories of those costs that should be reviewed, because maybe there's more of an incentive for those costs to go higher, to earn higher rates of return. Or maybe they are just areas where there are more frequent potential for cost overrun, like not assuming any motivation of anyone, but just there are places where more scrutiny is required to ensure that we are staying in some kind of cost band.
Thank you. And when you talk about the transparency, you mean in the planning process, not once the process gets to FERC.
Yeah, I mean, certainly in the planning process and even sort of up front, we've talked a lot about the CPCN process, and I'm sure we'll talk more about it and the role that plays. But if you don't have upfront certainty into here's why this choice was made, and here's why we made the choice to use this particular technology or choose this particular facility over another, then it's pretty hard to test those assumptions and figure out actually, have we made the right choices or were there other choices that we should have made?
Thanks. You both spoke a little bit to my next question, and this is for the broader group. Commissioner Christie's and all of us really have now been talking about this gap, this place where some states are going to have more review of a project in a CPCN proceeding than others. And if we were to say, okay, that's stipulated, we'll go do the research and figure out what kind of review exists and is allowable at state by state. What then might be a mechanism, in addition to potentially a lower ROE or some of the suggestions for greater scrutiny for categories of projects? Are there any other things that anyone else is thinking about? How would you manage fair treatment, appreciating that some projects are getting some local planning projects are getting more of a review at the state level than others? Maybe I should rephrase the question. Go ahead, John. Mr. Schneider.
Jumping into the breach. Right.
Thank you. It's uncomfortable here. Come on in.
Oh, yeah. So I speak for the Large Public Power Council. I should probably say that. They are the group of the largest state and municipal utilities in the country. And the perspective that they bring to that question is one that's not driven by any remuneration for investment. They charge the customers the cost that they incur, and they don't make money on transmission. So their perspective on how to look at that issue is really very much a sort of a consumer perspective. They're also most of them are quite green, and so driven by that as well. I think that additional transparency, as many have argued, and an upfront view of the planning criteria is important. I think you all took a significant step in that direction in RM 2117. There is a significant section toward you have to read 400 pages first, but there's a section on local planning in which you call for additional transparency with respect to the evaluation of local projects, which would set up the question whether the regional projects ought to supersede, proposals for regional projects ought to supersede those that are proposed locally. I think that's fine. We thought that was a fine idea. And so we fully support that. I'm very sympathetic to, I will say, Commissioner Christie's observation, and he really dug into this, that in many states, the states do look hard at need with respect to all facilities. It's obviously true in the states where transmission is bundled with distribution. They have responsibility for revenue requirements that are only to a modest extent driven by transmission, but they look at it as part of the. So and they. To be honest, I think some of them ought to step up to a greater extent. I'm not quite as sympathetic as some may be to the idea that states don't have the resources to do all this. I mean, I think if they care about it, they should do it. And looking to FERC to help fund or offset the cost of that charges the ratepayers anyway, because that is going to be included ultimately in the consumer cost. And the states that think they need to do it, there is a sort of a cost causation theory of that observation. And if they think they need to do it and spend the money, then ratepayers should step up. But we're fully behind this idea that transparency at the planning level is important. Transparency at the stage that the rates come to you in the form of formula rates is critical. I think that some of the proposals we heard on formula rates with respect to shifting the burden, beyond having spent, God help me, 25 years in FERC's trenches litigating cases, ultimately, I've been in practice for longer than that, but 25 years in the trenches. So ultimately, burden of proof seems to be less important than getting information. I never felt like when I was behind the ball as to burden of proof that I was going to lose the case if I had access to enough information to prove my case. And so shifting the burden might be useful, but I think much more important is the access to information.
Thank you. Mr. Macy, Ms. Freeman was next, and then Mr. Dennis. And Mr. Macy, can I add on to your part of the question, since you'll be speaking, is, from your perspective as an economics and law professor, talking about financial incentives within a utilities decision-making process as compares local planning, regional planning, and the opportunities. Will you speak to your perspective on that as well?
Yeah, so I'll go to the specific question, though I guess I'll start by saying it's interesting, this focus on the regulatory gap, which I think is significant, but I've heard sometimes that this is an ambitious FERC or something, and from my perspective, the debate that's being happened is so far from the economic ideal, and we're filling in gaps. But if we have local planning processes that suggest an absence of scrutiny, it looks like one thing in California, another thing in Florida. I learned a great deal. I worry that any approach that is based entirely on closing those discrete regulatory gaps has a hydraulic effect, and agencies will just be playing catch up. And so, yes, providing more scrutiny to local projects is one way to reduce the problematic ratio of local to regional projects. But overbuilding generation in transmission-constrained regions seems equally problematic to me. And so I think, to go back to your first question, not your second question, when you asked about formula rates and getting incentives right, I don't think that any agency has the administrative capacity to review every single line. And so there needs to be a broader set of incentives that assure us that we're building the right kinds of lines. And so when I think about transmission, I think there are only two cost questions. The first is this the right line, or are alternatives able to more cost effectively and efficiently and reliably meet our transmission needs? And the second is, are we containing costs of the line once it's selected? So if we're filling local gaps, I think that's a welcome development. But things like different ROEs for different projects where the benefits to cost ratio is different, providing incentives to assure ourselves that the costs of not keeping costs down fall on shareholders, not ratepayers. These are the types of things that mean your job as regulators, I think, is much, much easier. So in terms of filling local gaps, one reason I think it's the type of ROE adders Jeff and Chair Bartlett suggested are good is it reduces the need to do case-by-case scrutiny. But to the extent that the Commission is reluctant to consider market power issues in vertically integrated states, or say in MISO, and I have less concerns about that in PJM, I worry that just doing the local assessment is problematic. Then to go to the specific second question you asked, which I think is extremely important, I was sort of heartened by some of Commissioner Christie's questions, which I take it to sort of mean the process in Virginia at the CPCN stage is more robust than it is in other places. And I think that's right. And I think that if your question is getting at how the heck does the Commission know which states are not providing a robust look at local processes. I learned about 10 different problems today I didn't know until this morning. I think that shifting the presumption is helpful in that if what Virginia does at the CPN stage is a good example of at least one way to assess transmission lines, or at least gets us some of the way there, why not just say that in PJM's M3 process, each state has to say, like, it's not even a burden shifting framework when an individual state regulator says, provide us with all of that information. In states that do that, I think FERC should be able to free ride off of good state processes. And if that information is not there, FERC can just say, here are minimum standards. Those standards should be higher than they currently are of what needs to be provided. You should, what is the benefit to cost ratio? Did you consider alternatives? Did you wait until the very, very last moment? Did you consider regional lines? My own preference as I work at UChicago, where we always like competition, was there a competitive solicitation? These are things that make us much more confident that the lines that are being built are good and that costs are kept down. And so in states that don't have that process, I think, or requirements, I think utilities that don't provide that information should have an additional burden, which in many respects I think just brings them up to the Virginia standard.
I'll even take President Freeman since I'm here representing the organization of MISO states. I'm just kidding. Sarah Freeman, Commissioner with the Indiana Utility Regulatory Commission. But as I said, I am representing the organization of MISO states today, and I will do my best to distinguish my comments when they are my personal opinion as opposed to those reflecting the survey of our OMS members. I've lost track of what the actual question was. I'm not as good as Josh at keeping track of that. So I'm first just going to talk about the OMS overall opinion that having a baseline level of oversight is the most important thing we can do, and that does require greater transparency than we have. Oh, it's on. It says it's on. I'm not tall enough to reach all the way to the mic. Hang on. Okay. Little boost there. Sorry about that, everybody. I was just saying who I was and how I don't know what question I'm answering. But a baseline of oversight is imperative in the eyes of the OMS members, and we fully acknowledge the very robust stakeholder engagement process that MISO has, but I'll point out on behalf of my members that robust is not the same thing as transparent. We can get a lot of information and have a lot of dialogue, and I'm sure I'll have a chance to expand on this answer later, but that doesn't mean we, again, have the resources to do with it what we might want to. But at the end of the day, we want to see a process that yields the right type and amount of information to let us know that any transmission solution is the optimal solution to whatever the driver is, whatever the problem is that's being solved, right? But we also, whether it's FERC or whether it's a state commission, whoever it is in the stakeholder process, I feel strongly that we all need to do our jobs to the best of our abilities. So we use our existing resources. Commissioner Christie has asked several times about CPCN proceedings and what states have the power to do. We can open investigations when we need to. Do we always do it? No. And then finally, with respect to the ROE that came up earlier, these are utilities primarily with obligations to serve. I respect the answers given previously, and I know there's good reasoning behind incentivizing through ROEs, but this obligation to serve is there already. I'm not sure that it needs to be rewarded.
Thank you. I'm going to jump the line because I'm running out of time, but there's one more question I wanted to ask to Mr. Lee Van Skyke. I think you're in a really important position to weigh in on your perspective on the appropriateness and the value add of an independent transmission monitor in a region. I'm interested in particular in your view on whether or not what the relationship of an IMM might be with an ITM, whether or not you see redundancy or even any tension between those two potential roles.
Okay. Yeah, sure. Thanks for having me today. I appreciate the opportunity to speak with about these issues. So I don't really see a conflict. I think currently the role of market monitor typically doesn't include a scope that allows us to dig into issues that you would want ITMs to do. I mean, they're typically the only way that we look into the planning process currently is if there's some kind of concern based on our understanding of how planning inputs fit into the market, where there's some indication that there might be something discriminatory going on that is influencing the market, and so that leads us to investigate something in the planning process. But really, that's by exception if you sort of stumble on the problem based on reviewing capacity market outcomes. For the most part, it just seems like a different list of scope and tasks that you would have to complete, and there might be times where there's some overlap, but we have overlapping responsibilities with other entities, and when that happens, you want to verify that the other entity is doing something if you're not doing it, but I don't see that as being in any kind of conflict.
Great, thank you. I think my time is up.
Thanks, Commissioner Clements. First of all, I wanted to thank Chair Bartlett and Mr. Lee Van Skyke. Both of you actually participated in our forum in New England a couple of weeks ago, and I can't believe you wanted to come back for more punishment after that. That was a long day. So thank you so much for sitting through today and participating in our panels. I wanted to start with you, Mr. Snyder. In your comment, you raised an interesting question that we really haven't talked a lot about much today, about we're balancing here, because we're very interested in ensuring And consumers, as I said this morning, get the best bang for the buck. And our one of our main responsibilities is to ensure consumers are adequately protected in utility costs that are incurred prudently. But at the same time, we're talking about not wanting to discourage transmission investment as well, because as we know, there's for reliability reasons, for other reasons, we're going to need a substantial amount of transmission investment. So I was going to ask you, I know you wrote about abandonment and so on, and we have an interest in that, but I'm curious, I'll start with you, but I wanted to ask everybody, how do we balance that? How do we balance our need to ensure that consumers are adequately protected with the goal of not actually discouraging utilities from making investments, utilities and others from making investments in transmission?
Thanks for the question. I mean, obviously it's at the intersection of your most important responsibilities, right? You have responsibility to maintain reasonable rates, and at the same time, the lights can't go out, and you have policy objectives you'd like to accomplish. So I get all that. Also, and before I'm done, if I can, I would like to address the proposal to the point of cost management that we have addressed in this context. So I have a couple of observations. One of which is that if I could secure 7 to 11% on my pension plan, I would jump at that. And so it does seem to me that the ROEs at FERC are not ungenerous, and that there is a meaningful incentive to invest in transmission. Public Power has long weighed in on the matter of incentives and has argued that some of them are not necessary. It strikes me that there is more than enough incentive with the ROEs that you currently offer. I don't really want to quarrel with Josh's thought about reducing it for purposes of local projects, but it does seem to me that there's enough of an incentive. To the extent that the Commission exercises oversight and that scares investors, I think that's just tough luck. I think it's what you're supposed to do. You're a regulatory agency that's in charge of ensuring just and reasonable rates, and so I'm not frightened of that. I hope you were not. The proposal we advanced, I will say specifically to that point, is similar in some respects, but a little more expansive than what you heard from SPP and MISO on the last panel. We built on the MISO variance analysis in recommending that with respect to LTRTP projects, which is the next chapter in the book you're writing, that those projects should be monitored from the standpoint of the costs that are projected when they are initially approved. The projects are approved for cost allocation through the time that the investment is ultimately made, when the shovels hit the earth. That period of time, when one looks at a 20-year planning horizon, is no small thing. And the longer the planning horizon is, the riskier the investment becomes. LPPC, Large Public Power, was once not a fan for folks with an institutional recollection of long-term planning. We opposed Order 1000. It's not the boat we're in now. We've come to the table very much to support the Commission's initiative in moving ahead with long-term planning. But we ask you to recognize that along with long-term planning is a very substantial risk of getting it wrong when you look at over 20 years. If one looks back 10 years ago, when we were debating Order 1000, wind projects were the most predominant form of renewable resources. And we would have built transmission lines to reach wind in Montana and the Dakotas and run them right to Chicago. In intervening in 10 years, the solar industry has overtaken, for cost reasons, that set of precepts. So it seems to me, and I wouldn't argue that we shouldn't plan. In fact, we support planning 20 years into the future, but you could make mistakes. And so what we're asking the Commission to do is to enable the industry, the stakeholders, ultimately on the behalf of the consumers, to look at the projects when they're first approved and to follow them through their eventual construction, to look hard at two things. One, whether the costs have meaningfully varied from the initial estimates when folks thought it was a good idea. And second, whether the benefits, the need for the project has evolved, which could very well be with evolving technology. Gets that the grid enhancing technologies that are on the table are obviously a case in point. Nuclear fusion, which Bill Gates thinks is the next big thing, could change everyone's equation with respect to what resources are needed. And you want to have a chance to exercise an off ramp. If, as it turns out, an investment of several billion anticipated dollars, then transmission doesn't make sense. In exchange for that, because there is a sort of regulatory bargain that that from a legal standpoint I think you have to honor, we did represent that we thought that folks that have gone down the path with the commission and the regions in order to make investments in these projects are entitled to abandon costs pursuant to commission policy. So we thought that was the right thing to do. And I think to your point, Mr. Chairman, with respect to whether we're scaring investors off, it seems to us that agreement on our part ought to ensure that investors are not frightened.
Appreciate that. Mr. Norton?
Karen Honoran, Elcon. Thank you for the question, Chairman. I just wanted to tag along on some of the things that Mr. Schneider had to say. First of all, the incentives going forward, I think, I definitely agree with him that the incentives are substantial, and I think that they are, the utilities do have they do have to serve their customers, and so that's incentive enough. They do have other incentives that they, can do if they're using advanced technologies, that type of thing. So just to highlight what he said, wanted to follow up on another thing when he was talking, because we talked a lot, and I know we've talked the ITM issue to death, but one thing that we haven't looked at really in the cost management aspect. We've talked a lot about overlooking, the planning and helping consumers understand the various assumptions and the conclusions. But, I see a role for really monitoring the cost. And to the Chairman's question about, whether there is maybe a disincentive to invest. I mean, we really have not seen that. You can look at the competitive processes, and there are a lot of interest in those. And so I don't think that, transmission is a very attractive investment. And so I don't see that is going to be an issue. But I do, in talking about the competitive process, one thing that we have not talked about is, a lot of these proposals have cost caps or other rate-making proposals in there to try to keep costs low. We've heard from the RTOs, early on in Order 1000 that they may not have the expertise to actually, understand whether a certain rate treatment is just and reasonable. But to the extent that there are cost caps and off-ramps within a proposal, I would hope that there would be, maybe some independent transmission monitor role or some other role that would look at those and the viability of those, cost caps or other sort of treatments that, make the proposal, the winning proposal. And then I think the greatest concern for us is that, so the proposal is rewarded, the project gets built, perhaps they have cost overruns. So who is actually enforcing those cost caps or those, specific commitments that they made in their proposal? I can promise the world and then go and build whatever the heck I want to, unless somebody brings it up and says, wait, that's not what you proposed. So I really think that we need more scrutiny on the costs, and especially in the competitive process, to make sure that these cost caps and these off-ramps do make sense and do continue to protect customers.
Anybody else? Nope. I will. I'll move on to my next question, and something we talked about on several of the panels today, and that is alternatives. So we talked about alternatives in terms of local projects versus regional projects. We talked about different regional projects, and then of course other alternatives such as grid enhancing technologies, dynamic line ratings, things like that could maybe solve whatever problem's trying to be resolved without putting so much capital on the ground. And clearly, the incentive Utilities have the incentive, just the opposite. I mean, that's part of our regulatory problem with our regulatory structure is that we're incenting investment all the time and not incenting necessarily the smartest or most efficient type of investment. And I know we're not going to go to performance-based rate making as much as it's interesting. I think that would take. I think we have enough rulemakings already to deal with. But
Says we're not going there.
yeah, well, maybe we will. But anyway, I just want to get all of your thoughts about, in terms of the regions that you operate in or work in or oversee, and maybe start with you, Jeff, if you can, about how we should, what we need to change in terms of the market rules or the various rules we have with regard to transmission planning and so on, to encourage a better and more efficient approach to considering alternatives and to actually incorporating them.
I think you've hit on, I would say, a couple of things. One, the notices of proposed rulemaking that you have out right now on both transmission planning and generator interconnection do a good job of saying just and reasonable planning and just and reasonable interconnection processes take account of these things. But I think, again, here's where we go back to the independent transmission monitor or something else. How do you enforce that, right? And if you're a customer, what our members tell us is that a lot of times they suggest these things to a transmission owner, and the response is, and we've heard this earlier today, won't fit in our time frame, we're not quite comfortable with the technology yet, those kinds of things. And then you're kind of at a dead end. You don't really have a lot of information about, well, how did they consider that? And what factors did they take into account? So I think firming up the obligation is really important in both of those roles. And you have sort of, in the regulatory world, near-term opportunities to do that. And I think bringing transparency to the process so that when choices are made not to pursue those paths that are unreasonable when looked at both in terms of a cost perspective, but also in terms of how do I meet this need perspective, then you at least give customers another avenue to bring those problems to you to solve in targeted proceedings. And then that sets a long-term incentive for the industry to move on these technologies and get comfortable with them. The Commission has a really important role to play, as I learned when I was here, in making those kinds of technologies best practices over time. I will say, too, I know, recognizing your comment about performance-based rate making, you do have a proposal before you from AEE and the Watt Coalition to do just that with regard to dynamic line rating. Full record, wouldn't take you very long at all.
Thanks for reminding me about that. Mr. Lee Van Schaik?
Yeah. So I think one of the things that struck me earlier is that in the discussion of need is that the biggest thing that constrains your ability to really do anything with the proposal in front of you or what's in front of you is the time frame available for alternatives, and the fact that if really you only have one choice, then you only have one choice, and there's not much you can do if it is needed in the sense that doing nothing would result in a violation, but it doesn't tell you what kind of alternatives were available. And so having a process where the need determination has a lot more disclosure about the criteria, the reliability and transmission security criteria that's relevant to the need, and the criteria that's involved, so that you could look out over the time frame that's available and consider different generic alternatives. Because if you can conceive of generic alternatives to a given need, and you have better information about exactly the combinations of resources that could be used to satisfy it, then you really have something much more there to work with. And then that can flow into a process that's better at allowing for some kind of competitive solicitation. Oftentimes, part of the reason why you're so time constrained is because you might have a generator going away. But if you can, if you know enough about the alternatives that you would have available if you had a little bit more time, then you could use that information as the basis for doing something like an RMR agreement that would give you a bridge to having some time frame that allows for competitive solicitation. So I think that some process changes and transparency changes would make those sorts of measures more manageable. I think there's also, when you are considering alternatives, to view these things to look at the benefits in a way that uses the wholesale market value as the basis for doing a benefit assessment, and then looks at what's the net cost of this project. Like, each project has a whole bunch of benefits. Like, if you were actually generating revenues off of the transmission in accordance with its wholesale market value, you could essentially estimate what those revenues would be and then come up with an estimate of what's the net cost of the reliability need. And so that would give you a basis for comparing two projects that are really kind of an apples to oranges comparison, because, one has, benefit A, B, and C, and the other one has C, D, and E, and it gives you some basis for making more of a direct comparison of which one is the more cost-effective one. So I think that those are things to definitely look at.
Thank you. Mr. Ethia?
Thanks for the opportunity to be here this afternoon. I just wanted to invite Jeff to come to New England and experience the PAC process. I think we try to do a good job of sort of illustrating exactly the choice set that Jeff was talking about, where our engineers look at the problem and look at a variety of solutions and then lay out all the solutions for stakeholders. And we have a very robust discussion about what those potential solutions are. We take that back, we answer the questions, and then we go back to stakeholders again and say, look, we think this is the best solution, maybe tweaked in this way. I think the shortcoming there is that our states especially, and this is especially true going forward as we look at longer term planning, don't have the resources to contribute as much as they would like. So they have opinions about what they would like to see. We think they should have a very big role going forward in deciding how the transmission system gets expanded to meet their policy goals. But what we see as a concern is that they don't have the technical resources to engage more actively in helping us design what the future ought to look like. They have to rely on our technical resources, where it would be better to have a more robust flow with them, where they have folks who are using the models that we post, and we post excruciating detail on the models that we run. You can literally replicate our PSSE output with what we post on our website, as long as you have the appropriate software. We would love to see a situation where they have the engineering capability and depth to say, we looked at that and we think there's something that is maybe even a little more expensive, but it gives us a lot more ability to adapt to where we see the region going in the future. And to me, I want to get that on the table, because that, to me, is one of the biggest concerns I see for New England planning going forward. Thank you.
Mr. Schneider?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's always tempting at these conferences to want to be popular, So, but I will, at least in connection with the alternative technologies, take just a slightly different tack. So, the LPPC members, as I mentioned, make no money on investment. It's just not their thing, right? And so, if there are alternative technologies that enable them to avoid an investment, which would drive up customer rates, they would do it. They're interested in doing it. So they don't have the same incentives that the IOUs might have in order to build transmission and avoid gets. I will say, having grown up sort of surrounded by engineers, not just my family, but all my clients for the last, God help me, years, I know that they're a very conservative bunch, at least when it comes to the way they conduct their business. And I've heard time and again that while they're really intrigued by certain of the technologies, they don't know that they can be relied upon in order to provide firm service when the customers demand firm service. So they're worried about that. Obviously the Commission launched the AAR initiative, Ambient Air standard, some time back. It's only at its inception as we speak. It's being studied. The dynamic line ratings are another iteration, more sophisticated iteration of something sort of similar. And earlier, the comment made by Ken Seiler from PJM that it's important to drill down on exactly what the technologies can do really did resonate. And I know resonates for the engineers that we work for that really need to have these systems work when they're supposed to work. The takeaway, I guess, from that is it's good to consider them. I think the Commission asked parties to consider these technologies in connection with the NOPR. I think mandating them or coming something close to mandating them could put us in some hot water.
Thank you. Anybody else? Nope.
Very briefly, I think a lot of what Bob said about ICE New England is correct. I think the biggest thing that I think about as a state is that, ICE New England is obviously planning, and their key focus is reliability, as it should be. And they have the transmission planners, which again are trying to build projects to maximize reliability. What there isn't enough of is the countervailing pressure that is looking at the overall picture, the cost containment, looking at the alternatives, looking at some of the big picture regional issues in terms of how individual projects fit in. And I think that's where there's a real gap in that planning process. And then once the ship has sailed, we may get some of those projects in CPCNs, but it's a very diffuse way of trying to influence the overall management and development of the grid.
Thank you, Chair Bartlett. President Freeman.
Thank you. I changed my mind. It was up, it was down, but I'm like, what the heck? To follow up with what Chair Bartlett was saying, I was thinking along the paths of, and this could be at the state level, emphasizing the importance of coordinated or consolidated planning, whichever you want to call it, right? When we were, one of our utilities was doing a DER pilot, this was pre-2222, with MISO, we found out that there was not just a lack of visibility between the utility and the RTO. There was a lack of visibility within the utility itself, between its distribution and its transmission teams. And if you're not having it within a utility, and this is a good, reliable, safe utility that we regulate very well, what does that mean when you extrapolate from that, right? And then finally, also at the MISO level, at OMS, this is my opinion, not an OMS opinion, but we've been working a lot with MISO in developing attributes from which then market products can be developed. And you mentioned market rules in your question, but I'm thinking that can also come into play as well, right? Because if we're focusing on attributes, not only can, in my opinion, help us ease that transition from a thermal to a non-thermal resource mix, but also from wires to non-wires alternatives. Thank you.
I would also say that same disconnect also exists sometimes between RTOs and their utility members, their transmission owning members. I visited MISO. I remember talking to them about DLRs a couple of years ago, and they didn't have all the communications I thought that was appropriate in terms of the different transmission owners, in terms of the different standards that they used, and that's something I think we need to take a look at as well. Sorry, Mr. Macy, and then we'll move over. Promise.
I'll be quick, and I have no pretenses or desire to be popular. I think that the question about grid enhancing technologies is important because it illustrates how getting the design right of RFPs really matters. So I think there's reason to be extremely optimistic about grid enhancing technologies. There's evidence from Europe that in certain situations they've offered enormous benefits, but they're also speculative technologies. And so if it is a planning process in which shareholders are not price sensitive because it was a solicitation in which an agency says, I think these will offer these benefits years in the future, we're trusting administrative predictions about future technological advances and not having people who are truly price sensitive. So I guess I think I am very optimistic about grid enhancing technologies, but I think that to the extent they're part of meeting reliability needs, it's incumbent on the commission to make sure they're not just thrown into rate base or sort of gold plating, but that incentives are there to make sure that they're actually meeting. And this is especially important with all emerging technologies. And so that's just my pitch for RFPs.
Thank you, Mr. Macy. Commissioner Christie.
I'll start with Mr. Schneider, and you said so many things today I agree with. I'm not going to single them out, but I want to raise an issue that, and you alluded to it a little bit. We really haven't talked about it much today, but that is the question of cost recovery for abandoned plant. And FERC has a policy on that, and I would say, based on what I've seen, pretty generous. But should, and I'll ask this for the whole panel, anyone who wants to comment, but I'll start with Mr. Schneider. Should the lack of a state CPCN factor into whether a utility should get abandoned plant cost recovery? Because if they've not even gone to a state and sought a CPCN and haven't even proven need through that process, wouldn't that certainly be way on the side of, why are you getting abandoned plant? You haven't even sought a CPCN yet. Whereas on the other hand, if you got one and you proved it, maybe it's a different ballgame. I know these are fact specific, and all these cases are fact specific, and we do these on a fact case by case basis. But there's an overall policy and there's an overall framework. So I'm just asking, since we've been talking a lot about state CPCNs today.
So I think that the equation that you're making makes a lot of sense. And certainly to the extent that that there hasn't been adequate proof for the need for a facility, then the regulatory bargain doesn't seem to me to be quite as strong. Having said that, as a practical matter, I think that the amount of abandoned investment likely to arise with respect to the specific proposal that we've advanced, which is a fresh look at a project in between the time it's approved for cost allocation and the time that ground is broken, that the likelihood of that being a very substantial cost is not great. It's legal cost, it's some regulatory cost. It may be advance ordering of some type, which can be reversed. So to some extent, there's a risk-reward question here. And honestly, in exchange for what we thought is an important feature of this program, which is this oversight, we thought that, and to the chairman's point, we thought that assuring the investors that they got what they came for was an important part of that.
I would just say I can tell you about one example that never got to the CPCN approval stage.
Yeah.
And ran up hundreds of millions of dollars in recoverable costs.
Oh, well, that's instructive.
And I won't name names, but it can be a lot of money before it ever. But it can go into a regional plan approved, and run up hundreds of millions of dollars before it ever even litigates the state CPCN proceeding.
Right. Honestly, so we have nothing invested in assuring investor recovery. I mean, the LPPC members, the ones that I'm speaking for here today, nothing in that. So really, we thought about this proposal from the standpoint of what was practical, what was doable, to think about it in sort of political terms. I think you're right that if the project has not gone through all the process that it ought to in order to ensure that it was really a well-conceived project, that you're right, that the regulatory bargain is not quite the same as it otherwise might be.
Everybody agrees or what?
I just wanted to pipe in to talk about the regulatory compact, which I think there's no guarantee that utilities should be able to make a profit on all the time. The regulatory compact doesn't say that. You have an opportunity it's an end results test in which the decisions a utility makes have to be reasonable. And so we just should be very, very careful about cabining the scope, I think, of the regulatory compact. And I really, really hope it doesn't become a get out of jail free card because there's certainly no juridical requirement that a utility that made an investment decision in which there was no scrutiny has a legal right to recover on that. And so however we want to define that, I hope it doesn't convince us that investment decisions made in the complete absence of oversight are presumed to be prudently incurred.
We can talk about Bluefield Waterworks and Hope Natural Gas. We can go to town all day long on that one.
My job talk paper was about that, so.
Josh used the word juridical, so I felt the need to put my.
I wrote it down.
I think that there are legal requirements, and then there were practical policy requirements, right? I mean, and they're sometimes the same, and they're sometimes a little bit different. And I agree with Josh with respect to the fact that the courts have been clear that there are no guarantees. On the other hand, the chairman is not wrong that if we threaten investors, that investment might not be forthcoming. So there's a balancing act.
Thank you. Thank you all for being here again. I really just have, you've covered most of my questions, but Chair Bartlett, you mentioned in your statement a reliability standard, and so I cannot resist myself. You talked about we might want to look at how RTOs are applying the NERC's transmission planning standard to see if we can weigh reliability violations based on risk or urgency. Could you explain for us how an ITM might be able to help with that?
Yeah, I think one of the concerns that I've had is, or that in my office has had, is that if there's a NERC violation, there's a violation, and that's whether it is something very small or whether it has a huge impact, and they're not really weighted or prioritized. And I think that goes to partly some of these regional considerations, right? How urgent is this project vis-a-vis projects that are being looked at in other states in the region? Could we, one, develop a little more nuance in interpreting those NERC standards so that we understand, okay, there's a violation, how urgent is it, what's the likely impact on customers, does it need to be fixed right away? Could this wait for part of, do some of that analysis would be really useful. I think the other thing to look at is how NERC standards are applied. It's not as if there is just a firm standard. I mean, every RTO applies it and interprets it their own way. And so we now have a comparison, or should have a comparison, about how different folks are doing this across the country and what the reliability benefits are. Some are more conservative than others. Are those that are sort of more conservative and making sure they're getting these violations fixed right away, is that creating real reliability benefits versus somebody else who may have a little bit more lax standard? So that to me, that kind of analysis could be really useful to help informing how decisions are made at the level. And I think in ITM, I would certainly want them to be assigned a role in that, to help to identify those places where either more analysis has been done or to bring in outside analysis to better inform the decision making.
Sort of like a wide area view.
Yeah, I mean, I think the idea you want to both have them very much engaged in the planning process and the cost recovery process, but you also want them making some real recommendations on how the process can be improved and helping, I think, hold everybody accountable. So if there's NERC standard violations, would that be a violation in another RTO? Why or why not? And if one is treating it as a violation and one is different, we should be able to assess whether it's truly cost effective to make that upgrade.
Be careful, you're going to find yourself on the standard drafting team. We have two cards. Please.
Yeah, just for something like that, I think it's usually the case that you could take an issue like a violation and translate it into something that would let you compare it with other similar issues in order to set priorities. So most criteria violations can be resolved at some point by just shedding load, which is not necessarily part of the criteria, but you could always evaluate the significance of an issue economically by relating it back to the potential for disconnection of load, and then relating it to concepts like value of lost load. And so that gives you some basis for assessing the reasonableness of a need, because maybe something is technically needed, but if viewed in those terms, it might be that the entity that ultimately gives the authority to go through with the project might decide not to, because the state doesn't necessarily have to actually authorize everything that's supporting reliability. So I think that things like that, if the process was more transparent, it would lend itself to those kinds of informational, that sort of information.
I just wanted to make a process point, which is I hope our operations people didn't hear the part about violating NERC standards. So, and it's not that we are not willing to have those conversations and discuss how NERC standards and also NPCC standards that we must adhere to, how they affect us, how we make planning decisions, and where they might be relaxed. I think probably from the ISO perspective, it's going to be more of a, okay, we all agree it's an inappropriate standard or it's overly restrictive in our case. We're probably going to push in a way that we don't violate the standard. Rather, we talk to NERC and figure out a way that we can work with NERC to either adjust the standard or interpret it in an appropriate way. We have a very strict culture of adherence to NERC standards, and that will be a hard rock to lift, I think, if we keep it that narrow. But if we look at it more broadly, I think we can have a good conversation.
Excellent point. Yes, sir.
Hello, Chairman Phillips. Thank you. I know this panel is supposed to go until midnight. You have this, and maybe there'll be time to further discuss the ITM, but maybe not. I don't really know what your plans are. I did want to offer a couple of thoughts on the ITM generally, having listened to the discussion this morning, and if later after break is the right time, I'm happy to do it then.
Please proceed.
Yeah. with I hope the sort of firmly established predicate that that LPPC is all about lower rates and satisfying our policy objectives, which are green and meaningful. I think that the importance of transparency for us and process, improving existing processes, is the most critical element of how we can improve our current situation. Randy Howard's comments about the level of transmission cost in California are pretty eye-opening. So we sort of knew this was happening, and here we are. The ITM is an interesting challenge, at least for us. On the one hand, because LPPC would like to see lower costs and they would like to see a cop on the beat, so to speak, it's tempting. We've heard sort of two roles articulated for the ITM. One involves cost oversight and one involves grid planning. And it seems to me that the case for them, for each of these roles is different. With respect to cost oversight, I'll say this. And again, we want to see the costs reduced, without a doubt. We have three institutions on the scene as we speak, right? Four, right? We have the commission, we have state commissions, we have RTOs and ISOs 3, and if we need a fourth institution, it does strike us that something's sort of going wrong with respect to the oversight exercised by the folks that are already looking at this. Commissioner Christie bore down on the CPCN process and the extent to which states which do have the authority should be looking hard at need and may not be looking hard at need. So there's that. FERC, long ago, we were critical at the commission of formula rates, long ago, because we thought they undermined the regulatory incentives that were implicit in old-fashioned regulation. We didn't really care for it. That boat has sailed to some degree. I get that, but improving the data flow with respect to formula rates seems important to me. So, and then you have the RTOs, which ought to be making important decisions with respect to how investments are classified. Should they be classified to local planning projects or regional planning projects? And then we would ask the monitor to come in and do something more, something these other entities are not able to do. And the question is, is that value added? LPPC is not so sure. And it's not because they don't want to see the cost down or because they are making money on investment. They're just not sure that it's value added. And if you improve the transparency of the processes, beef up staffs at the state and the commission and the RTO levels, we're not sure that the ITM is cost beneficial with respect to cost oversight. So we're not unsympathetic to it. And then just briefly on the planning side, we're not unsympathetic to it. We had Karen Onaran and I had a conversation earlier. We are going to talk about it, but we're a little bit circumspect. With respect to planning, I think the case is really very different. Speaking again for LPPC members, these are some of the greenest utilities in the country, and they know they have to accomplish renewable portfolio objectives articulated by the communities. And one reason we're here at this table and have agreed that the RM 2117 NOPR makes sense for us is that we know we're going to need transmission in order to do that. Those public policy objectives are going to drive LSD needs, and we're going to drive the planning process in order to make sure transmission gets built. Do we need somebody else at the table to tell us what we need? We're not so sure. We have state commissions that will take a look at this. We have the FERC, and we have the RTOs. We're not sure that an independent transmission monitor is necessary to help us articulate the policy objectives that we know we have to accomplish.
Well, thank you for that. That was very well said. So I won't even comment on it. I'll let it stand. I'm going to read the room too. I have 2 minutes left, and every card but one is up, I think. So let me just say this. Let me just make a quick comment. Actually, no, I won't.
I can do it.
President Freeman,
Yes.
you have my final word.
My answer was yes.
You all won't hear from me again today.
That's it. Just yes.
Just yes? Okay.
Would it help? Yes.
Okay, that's good. I will make my comment then. I take it back. I just want to say, this is my closing. I think the word for today, and I think the evidence would show this if you look back to the record, is that so many people talked about transparency today. And you heard people say, well, we need more information. Some people say, well, what would we do with it if we had it? And some people said, well, costs are already low, so why would you have more process? I mean, I think it's worth saying this. When it comes to transparency and OATT and our processes, we say principles that are required for the OAT process. There are 9 principles, and one of them is transparency. So when it comes to transparency, it's not a nice to have. It's a feature, not a flaw. So with that, I thank you for your time.
You just want to go down that way? Sorry, I wasn't paying attention.
So I just wanted to make a comment, I think, on what I see as limitations of sort of the state review process or the CPCN process as a stand-in for the kind of oversight that we're talking about that an ITM might be able to help us provide. If you think of a region like New England, we have 6 states, and a few projects will come to Maine for a CPCN. But I'm making that decision without being able to put it into the regional context, without understanding really what's happening in Vermont or Connecticut, which might be looking at their own projects that contribute to costs. I don't really know what the prioritization is of those things. So I think, to me, that's a really serious limitation. And and at that point, the project is baked. We can try to look at alternatives, but the project is pretty far along at that point. So even a very robust process, in my view, is not a substitute for really engaging early on in the planning process. It's also not a substitute for following through afterwards. When we have a CPCN, once we issue that certificate, our job is done. And then the costs go up through to FERC, and we're not judging prudency at that point. On the distribution side, when we're doing rate cases, we are always looking at the prudency of investments that have been made, and that includes the management of those projects in development. And we routinely disallow costs if we think there are unreasonable overruns or other issues. So both in terms of not being present at the planning stage and not being present sort of after the CPCN process or on the cost management side, I think is a really shortcoming of even the most robust CPCN process.
Okay, so I think that if a poorly designed ITM, I guess we're back to ITM, would be, it's like a Bavarian nightmare. It's the 4th or 5th or 6th regulatory body. But I appreciated the questions earlier about what a well-designed ITM looks like, and I think there are a few principles that to me are important, and that it does look a little bit like an IMM. So first, the theme of today seems to be we don't have key reports to see how money is spent, where there are gaps in regulatory assessments, where there are alternatives. Could different lines have more cost-effectively done this? And so the first thing that an independent transmission monitor could do would actually look at, just identify where those gaps are. That's the lowest hanging fruit. It's not what lines should be built. It's not an alternative regulator. It's just an assessment of what are the regulatory gaps, given how many there seem to be and how hard it seems to be to figure them out. Where there are gaps in money being spent, I think it would be really, really helpful to have a baseline against which to compare the lines that were built to the lines that could be built. I don't think of that as another transmission planning entity. I think of that as providing information upon which to make later regulatory decisions. 3, I think that there are just jurisdictional tensions or jurisdictional silos that make it very, very difficult for any one regulator to do a sort of comprehensive review throughout the life of a transmission line. So the CPCN happens at one point, but it is my experience that when cost overruns happen, they are automatically passed through. So we should look at the CPCN, but we need subsequent review to make sure that costs are kept down. Similarly, and this is I don't mean to just parrot Chairman Bartlett, it is important to have a synoptic assessment of how reactive we're being, what harmonization among states would drive costs down, and a state level or a very deferential approach by RTOs and by FERC makes that impossible to do. So that's a way of saying I think it does look like an IMM, but it has a unique set of responsibilities given that transmission looks different from the things an IMM does. And then you can debate about like what other things it should do, and I think those are important debates. But there's some pretty low-hanging fruit.
It's like somebody just threw hearts. All the signs go up. Everybody can release their cards now. First, I'm going to limit my comments to the planning side of what an ITM might do, not the cost side, because that's really more an RTO's role. And I would like to confess at this point that I'm an ex-market monitor, so I have maybe a somewhat unique perspective on this. And to me, the big difference between what a market monitor does and why they exist and the talk about an ITM is data availability. The reason a market monitor, in my recollection, exists is primarily because they could have access to confidential data that only the RTO and the FERC could otherwise see. So there are other reasons, but that's a primary reason. That does not really exist in the transmission planning world, in my view. Sure, you have to get CEII clearance, but if you have a reasonable address and you know how to fill out forms, you can generally get that. To me, the ITM motivation is understandable, but because we don't have the same limitations in data availability, we don't necessarily have to adopt the same structure. And I look at the New England case and I look at the question that you all posed to us about long-term transmission planning and the ITM, and to me that says is there's a need for more public planning ability, more public technical capability, but I'm not sure that an ITM reporting to the commission, or certainly not reporting to the ISO, makes sense. If we have an ITM that reports to the states, I could understand that, because to me, what the states need are resources to deal with the future. We, in New England at least, are going to ask a lot more of the states going forward. We are going to look for them for guidance on public policy projects in a way that we never have before. And it frankly makes me nervous, the idea that they're not going to have additional resources to help fill that role. That's very different than, frankly, what we've done in the past. And I worry that the ITM is maybe looking a little backwards and not forward. Although I will say it might be interesting the first time the ITM disagreed with the state determination. So that might be a sort of interesting conversation to watch but not be a part of. So I would just, say that my view when I looked at the ITM was it's a way of providing resources to the process, and a process that's going to need a lot more resources going forward. And I don't think we have the same limitations that we had when we set up the IMM structure because of the data issue. There's some other issues about the differences between how economists do their work and engineers do their work, and how more broadly applicable that is. But I think the primary one is data availability. So thanks.
Oh, I'm sorry.
I'll try to be really quick. I raised my card just to say I was kind of thinking about this, and if I was back here advising the commission, for a lot of what's been said here, I would advise focusing an ITM on information transparency and availability. I think when it comes to planning, we have RTOs. Our members think RTOs are the best platform for transmission planning. That's why we advocate for improving them and expanding them. But we have utilities that know how to plan too. The question is, and the question you've heard today is, are they planning in a way that complies with Order 1000 on a regional level? And do we think that the choices can we test the assumptions, at least, of the choices they're making to get to better cost outcomes? And so I think that's the real value of an ITM and the transparency it provides. This notion of, well, what would we do with the information if we had it, I think is a bit of a misnomer. If we had an ITM and at the end of the day we found out everyone's planning really well and customers could be assured that the money that was being spent wisely, that would be a really good reason to do an ITM. I don't think we'll find that, but.
Yeah, I want to echo pretty much everything that I've heard here, on the ITM. Again, just to put a fine point on how, we would see an ITM. There's definitely no specific authority. They would have filing authority. They could file reports at FERC. And this idea of transparency goes beyond just data flow. There are very sophisticated people out there that can interpret this, but there are a lot of unsophisticated people that do want to have some sort of input and be reassured that the right choices were made, that the costs are kept down as much as possible. And everybody has their role. They have the state role, the federal role, as we've all pointed out. But there is a lot that came out of Order 1000 that just kind of went sideways. And I think one of the reasons was, there were loopholes that, others took advantage of perhaps. And I really just see the independent transmission monitor as a check on that, as someone who understands the system, who can, like I said, identify some of the gaps in either the information flow or how those choices. I've heard from a lot of states, and it's been eye-opening that they just they don't have all the information, so they're just kind of trusting the part of the RTO or the transmission owner in the case of non-RTO regions. And so I really just, to what Jeff was saying, that sort of confidence that the consumer could have, that things were done according to Order 1000, according to the tariff, that, gets were considered. There's not much of an incentive right now for utilities to adopt GETS. Some of them are looking into it, sure, but there's just not that, almighty dollar with the transmission lines. So I really just find this as, sort of a touch point for the customer to really understand what's going on, what's needed on the system, and how we get there, and assure us that, because we're looking at billions of dollars, if not trillions, to get to a lot of these zero carbon goals that many, this administration has set, or many even individual companies and utilities. So we're looking at a lot of money, and we just need that reassurance that the I's have been dotted, the T's have been crossed. There is an independent, they have no skin in the game necessarily. They're just there to make sure that as consumers, we can ask questions. It's not just, well, here's our engineering data, because I'm not going to be able to do anything with that. That's why I was an English major. So, there needs to be that sort of intermediary, and again, with the states to help them understand, to maybe bridge that gap and say, this is what happened during the planning region. We looked at this, and this. We decided to go, this was the project that was chosen. These are the reasons. That gives a little bit more of that transparency to the state, so they too can feel confident if they issue a CPCN, or even if there is no CPCN, that somebody looked at this and that the rates should be, just and reasonable, and that costs are maintained, kept low, and that the most cost-effective solution was actually selected.
Thank you for this opportunity. I just want to quickly share the OMS experience that allowed me to give my brief yes answer to Commissioner Phillips' question earlier. Only one of our members has any type of transmission planning staff, and that's Wisconsin, as you heard Lauren Azar mention earlier today. When following our foray into cost allocation, which was very exciting, but as we were getting more into the planning phase of MISO's long-range transmission planning process, we realized we needed more insight than we had, and we didn't have resources in our individual states to pool together to get what we needed. So OMS put out an RFP and did end up hiring an independent consultant in the transmission planning area to look into the LRTP projects on our behalf. It was challenging in a couple of respects. One, we have 17 members. There are a lot of different utilities in those member jurisdictions, thus creating a lot of conflicts for experts who might be able to help us. We ended up finding somebody, a company in Maine, Chair Bartlett, who was great for us. But because they were an ISO New England expert, they were not a MISO expert. So part of our budget did end up going towards working with them, getting them up to speed on the differences between the two. And they were very helpful, hence my yes answer. But at the same time, under the current construct, finding adequately independent and not non-compromised, but people who don't have non-conflicted, people who can help is challenging.
Thank you. So I would wager you all think that enough has been said about the ITM at this point. So I should just tell a joke, right? And then I have a recollection, honestly, that's a little bit different from Paulus's about the creation of the market monitors and the timing and the way that came to pass. In or about the turn of the 21st century, the Commission was just desperate in the face of markets that they didn't understand and were blowing up in the West. And they knew, they didn't just fear, but they knew they didn't have the expertise to police those markets. They didn't have statutory authority, and they didn't have the expertise. And so they reached out as the RTOs became more sophisticated and began to administer the organized markets. They reached out to find the intellectual and the computer-based infrastructure in order to police the markets. I remember going up to the Commission's monitoring floor at office at some point, and it was really clear that there wasn't enough of the good stuff to administer an organized market, to police an organized market. So they brought the MMs in. Transmission, by comparison, is well within your expertise. It's what you do. You police transmission costs. I mean, it's in the statute. You have the staff for it. There was a time before Formula Rates when you had staffs devoted to rate case after rate case. So I don't think we would die on our sword over the creation of a market monitor to take a look at costs. I mean, it may be drop in the bucket with respect to cost, but it will be costly, and there is the potential to conflict with priorities with respect to planning. I appreciate Jeff Dennis's comment that that's the RTO's job. Why would you have someone else mucking around in the area? So anyway, we ask you to think about it very carefully before moving ahead.
Can I just say, it'll take 30 seconds. My favorite part this morning was, it happened twice, but two members of industry were asked, does your planning process work? And the answer was yes, of course. Do you want to market an ITM? The answer was definitely not. But these two positions are incompatible, because if the current planning process is perfect, an ITM will validate that. And so if you object to a ITM, the implication seems to be you are worried about the skeletons that'll come out of the closet. Because otherwise, the results of the ITM, if it shows everything is hunky-dory, why would we be concerned about that? The second point is I have significant governance concerns about the process that yields regional transmission plans. And given current governance issues, more transparency is very helpful.
Yeah, just commenting on the notion we already have ISOs or RTOs that are independent. I think the nature of the relationship they have with utility companies is special, because the transmission owning utilities are just very influential within the ISO, and I don't think it's easy for them to scrutinize the local transmission plans in a way that you really need to have. In some cases, the ability of, they're trying to attract customers, really. And so I think, we found that they're extremely deferential to the concerns of the local transmission owners, and it's just hard to see that they'll be able to scrutinize things or ask questions or get them to look at alternative assumptions in the way that you would need in order to have those to avoid making, being too deferential, I guess, to the transmission owners.
Yes, I just had a follow-up question. We hear a lot about the ITM, and we trust the ITM a lot. Things like that to do a good job so everybody can trust it. So you think that in the future that the ITM can replace the existing planning entity? Because it's do pretty much the same thing and do much more than that, and we don't trust them. Anyone?
No, the way I see it is more of a coordinating role. Coordinating, making sure that all the stakeholders have the information that they need. And we've talked all about the RTOs, but we haven't talked about the non-RTOs. There's God knows what happens there. And so I think an ITM is very important in those regions, just to give consumers the confidence that they are planning correctly and they are keeping costs in mind. I know the states would check on that, but I think there is transmission planning. Commission does have authority over it. Under Order 1000, the non-RTOs did have some requirements. And so I don't see it as replacing or ever replacing the transmission planning. I really just see this as a role to reassure, to check, to make sure it's a double check and make sure that everything was followed, everything was done, the alternatives were considered. And also I can see a role for them in helping with interregional transmission planning as well, because I think everybody kind of gets into their own little corner there, and having different ITMs talk to each other in the regions to have them, discuss. They could also find those holes that maybe the RTOs are blind to because they're much more concerned about their own footprint. So I don't think that we would ever want to see an ITM replace, an RTO or become the transmission planner, because then we would want a double check on them too. So that really is just, I guess a cop on the beat, but not necessarily enforcing anything, but can raise flags, can report on gaps and things that they are concerned about. If they see concerns with a transmission planning process or what the decision was, they can certainly raise those concerns at FERC, either through a 206 filing or other report. And so it's just a gut check. So again, don't see that being a replacement role.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, Karen said a lot of what I was going to say. I don't think that you've heard today a lack of trust in the ability of planners to assure reliability. I think what you've heard is questions, at best, uncertainty about whether things like the regional planning process that FERC asked to do a check on local plans, not to say, let's muck around in this to see if it's really reliable or not, but are there things we can do at the regional level to meet those same needs more cost effectively and efficiently? And I mean, I went back and revisited Order 1000. The commission was very clear about that. But I think if you've heard anything today, it's at best people are not sure that's happening, or at worst, some people are saying in some regions it's maybe not at all.
I guess I would just add that, I agree that the RTOs at ISO New England, in particular, does a very good job in terms of planning for liability. And so that's not so much the concern. The concern is that if you look at ISO New England's tariff, nowhere in its mission does it talk about ratepayers or costs. It's not its core mission. It's not what it's there to do. And so the question is, how do you provide that kind of competing pressure and accountability to make sure that you're getting not only were the reliability benefits maximized, but there's also you're maximizing consumer value and minimizing costs for ratepayers. I'm here because I believe in transmission. I believe we're going to need to spend a lot of money in order to bring on the clean energy resources and to increase the load the way we're going to need to over the next 10, 20, 30 years. So what I care about is making sure that I can talk to my constituents back in Maine, talk to folks, that they understand that these investments are being made wisely, that every penny is being stretched as far as it absolutely can, because we will lose the public if we are not doing the work of making it very open, transparent, and accountable. Because if costs just spiral upward and they don't have that confidence, we will be dead in our tracks in terms of trying to make this transition.
I think we're nearing the end. The time is running out. So, are there any closing statements?
I mean, is this closing or just?
Or
closing?
if you still want to ask questions, go for it.
Okay. One of the most intriguing things I heard, Mr. Nathier, is I get the name. I've talked to you a lot named Bob, but I get the last name pronounced. It ties in with what Chairman Bartlett said. And it's like, what would an independent market monitor, transmission monitor, do in an RTO context? And you made an intriguing point that if they were there to provide information to the states that lack the resources and the expertise. Now, I agree with you. I don't. That's the sob story. I don't necessarily agree with, but there's quite. But nevertheless, that. And I think about, okay, Mr. Paulus is sitting back there. Okay, the consumer advocate of PJM is funded through the tariff, but it's, that's how it's funded. The IMM in PJM is funded through the tariff. If you treated a transmission monitor similarly, but then define their role as there to gather the information and provide it to the states who needed that kind of expertise in their CPCN proceedings, particularly those states who say they don't have the expertise or they don't know what's going on in other states. Maybe that might be. I'm just thinking. I'll just ask you all to comment on that kind of structure as opposed to an inside the building FTE, certainly with 206 rights. I think that's a tough. That's a big jump. But if it were informational, and particularly if it was there to provide assistance, maybe even funded through the tariff, the same way Mr. Paulus is funded through the tariff and Joe Bowering is funded through the tariff. I mean, that would be truly independent. But I just following up on your comments, Mr. Ethier, I thought that was an intriguing way to look at a transmission monitor, particularly from an informational standpoint in an RTO, a multi-state RTO. Just following up on that. I'm not endorsing it, but I just thought it was intriguing the way you presented it.
I did want to say, because I should have said this earlier, in our comments, in AE's comments, we suggested that the commission lay out the functions of an ITM. What is the transparency they have to provide? What are the categories? But we also explicitly suggested that the commission allow RTOs and ISOs the flexibility to demonstrate that they meet those transparency and those functions another way, perhaps through their existing IMM, perhaps through some other function that they do, like Mr. Ethier has talked about. I think, again, going back to our members' view that RTOs are the best platform to do this, I think it would be appropriate for the commission to give RTOs and ISOs more flexibility to say we provide this information in this way, as long as you've clearly set out what is the information that we expect to be collected and provided.
Mm-hmm. Just to sort of further illustrate the point, I guess, let's call it 10 years ago. My predecessor in this role kept hearing about how there wasn't enough transparency at the ISO. So he went into a meeting and he had his assistant print out all the information that we had posted to our website on a particular transmission project. And it was crazy amounts of paper. And he then asked the question, what more information would you like? And there were crickets. And the conversation changed, and now it was, we don't have the ability to digest all the information, which is, frankly, as the ISO, that's where we don't want people not to have the ability to digest it, but we want to put out enough information that people have what they need. We have, lots of information, and I think we're good about responding and putting more out there. And what we're hearing now, and have been hearing for a number of years, is we don't have the ability to digest it and engage with it in the way that we want. I saw the ITM as a way to, frankly, fill that need. So selfishly, trying to repurpose it a little bit. But just wanted to give you a little more background on why I have that view. And in light of the long-term transmission planning that you all are looking at and that we have embraced, I think that's only going to become more serious issue in the future. Thanks.
This is extremely quick. I had never thought about it in those terms before. My initial reaction is that the independence prong you laid out would be absolutely crucial to making that approach work. That if it's not independent, and so if the commission goes that way, for whatever it's worth, my own view is that you should be as explicit about the need for independence as you are about the other half of Commissioner Christie's proposal.
I just want to just make briefly the point that I think the problem we're dealing with, is more fundamental than whether to have we get more information for the states or not. I think we're talking about the FERC's responsibility to make sure the rates are just and reasonable, and real gaps in the accountability that we're seeing in achieving that, and real questions about whether the transmission investments are getting the level of scrutiny they deserve. And certainly from Maine's perspective, we're open to any wide number of alternatives, but whatever we do, whether it is sort of providing information to the state or otherwise, it can't be the only fix. That's maybe one piece of the puzzle, but there has to be a clear path to figure out how to either change the burden at FERC through the formulaic process, or how to make sure that issues are brought to your attention when they need to be. And so and I also think that expecting the states to act alone when you're one member of a 6-state RTO is a challenge, because you need a regional perspective. And Maine can only choose to invest its resources in certain areas where we think there's, where we think there's going to be the highest value for Maine ratepayers. The idea, I think, between having some kind of independent transmission monitor is you have someone who is taking that regional view and is there in the trenches every single day and isn't necessarily going to have to rely on the states to press ISO for more information or to get information in front of you to make better decisions.
OMS does support a limited role in the transmission planning side of things for an incredibly independent transmission monitor. Having said that, of course, effective oversight and evaluation of transmission planning would hopefully result in positive cost impacts for customers as well, ensuring optimal solutions are chosen. But with your focus on state CPCN, I'm going to push back on that a little bit. We surveyed our members, and Indiana was the state that does not have any CPCN authority for transmission. Ours are generation only, and therefore I would contend that the oversight, that having the ITM involved at the RTO planning level is important as well to ensure that all states could benefit from that entity.
Well, let me respond to that. And by the way, Chairman Bartlett, I haven't heard anybody today say that states are on their own or that there should be alone. I mean, I'm talking about a continuum of scrutiny from the RTO level to the state CPCN and then back up here when formula rate time comes. So it's really three separate, and they're all connected and they're not in a vacuum. And Sarah, I can't believe you all don't have a CPCN authority over transmission. I mean, I would imagine you want it. You'd like to have it.
I am but one commissioner here today. I would not dare to speak, even on my own behalf.
Okay.
And don't talk to our legislators, please.
Right.
Okay. We're going to go to the conclusion statements. Because of time constraints, we're going to start with Commissioner Clements.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I think, Chairman Bartlett, your point kind of focused where I was going to end, which is, the Commission's bread and butter authority is to ensure just and reasonable rates, both in the context of wholesale sales and in the context of transmission. So what we did on the wholesale sales side, for a various set of reasons, was establish an independent market monitor. For a different set of reasons, whether or not it's the same market failure or design framework failure that required the IMM, versus the ones that we need that involve both transparency and the ability to translate large stacks of information into English, those are things that we can do and are not difficult to do. To borrow an earlier statement from today, our staff is also world-class. Our audit team does a great job on their audits and enforcement, and they can only do 12 to 14 a year, right? Our team on OEMR has made improvements this year in stakeholder ability to engage on formula rates, which I think is underappreciated but important. But that said, we still have this structural problem, this inability to really dig in at the formula rate step. And there are all these different things we can do along the way to help improve that. And I think I'm hearing the customers and the states largely, with some exceptions in today's panel, support this idea still to be refined and defined better of an independent transmission monitor. The cost is peanuts on the dollar of deferring one transmission investment, right, for many years forward. But if that's not the way you think we get at these problems, we certainly are open to other ideas relating to prudence, relating to formula rates, relating to other things going on in regional processes, but whether it's cost-specific, planning-specific, or otherwise. So I think I hear a real need to take action, and I'm glad that there's an emerging view that is the case, and I look forward to continuing to engage. I hope you'll all submit great comments to continue the dialogue after today. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Commissioner Clements. I know you need to get out of a couple of things. First of all, I wanted to start by thanking all the panelists. We had 5 excellent panels today, and you spent a lot of time and effort getting here, and really appreciate you participating today. And even more so, I want to thank the staff for, again, an excellent job of putting together the panels, putting together the information. We had like a 500-page briefing book, which I won't grumble about, but it was really well done, and thank you so much for all your efforts. I just wanted to make a couple closing comments. First of all, to me, we used and Commissioner Phillips used it first, I think, the term regulatory gap. And to me, there's a couple gaps here. There's a gap. There seems to be, based on the discussions we've had today, gaps between FERC's authority, the state's authority, and the RTOs in terms of our roles, particularly in protecting consumers from decisions that are made in local transmission planning, regional transmission planning, and other transmission activities. So I think that's an important element we need to think about. Secondly, there's clearly an informational gap in the sense that a number of people either don't feel like they have the expertise or the access to the information necessary to make the decisions, or either to make the decisions that have to be made or to participate significantly in the proceedings that we have or states have or others have in terms of when these decisions are made. So I think those are 2 items I think we need to address going forward. As everyone knows, we have initiated a number of proceedings on transmission reform. We've already acted, at least in terms of an NOPR, on cost allocation and transmission planning, and also on interconnection. We have, in my opinion, more work to do on transmission, and hopefully more NOPRs to come at some point. But I think the issues that we discussed today and the information we derived or will derive from the record, I think will help us make that decision. So thank you all for everything you've done. And I'll move forward and ask, I know Commissioner Danley doesn't have a closing statement, so I'll ask Commissioner Christie.
Well, I just want to thank everybody who showed up today. I mean, this was the first time we've done one of these live since I've been here, which is since COVID. And so this was great. And I like these things. I hope we do more of them. And some of you all came from a long way away. And so I really, just want to echo the chairman. Thank you all for coming. It was a lot of time and a lot of travel for a lot of you. So thanks for coming. It was a great panel. I think there's 2 big issues that came out of this, at least in my opinion, which I would invite people to submit anything they want to submit afterward, flesh out maybe what you said today or react to what some others said you didn't get a chance. And one of them is I thought it was your term, the regulatory gap, but apparently you said Commissioner Phillips had the regulatory gap. So either way, it's a good term. Forget the missile gap from the 1960 presidential campaign, but which was made up. But this is a real thing. This is a real thing. There is a gap at what scrutiny is taking place at the state level, and yet that is where all these projects should be scrutinized. Now the RTOs are doing, they're doing the planning if it's a regional transmission organization. But I think that we had a lot of testimony today from a lot of people in different parts of the country that the gap or we should say that the variety, let's call it the variety, in what states have authority to do and take a look at, it varies greatly. So, as Commissioner Clements said, we have authority over J&R rates at the wholesale level and transmission. We don't have authority to tell a state how to structure your CPCN process, but we do have authority to say who gets formula rate treatment when you come here. And so I'd like to hear comment on whether FERC should give formula rate treatment to a transmission project or projects plural that have not been subjected to a robust state permitting process. And corollary to that is, what do you think a robust process looks like? To me, I'll give you a minimum. At a minimum, a robust state permitting process would be looking at not just cost, prudence of cost, but also looking at need. At least those 2 things, need and cost, should be part of a robust state permitting process. And so I would, and there could be other things you'd like to see. The issue of cost caps on an ongoing basis is another issue. Can the state enforce that, or is the state simply, is it done when it finishes the CPCN? I'd love to hear more from people But I think that's a big question that came out of this is we control formula rates, okay? We don't control how states structure their processes, but we do control formula rates. And should we be looking at the robustness, if that's a word, of what takes place at the state level? Which is not to say that that's in a vacuum and states are on their own and, we don't look at what the RTOs do or how they do it. But I think if you look at the three sections we've talked about today, the RTO planning part, the state CPCN part, and then the formula rate part back up here when it comes time to pay the bill, each one of those really connect. So I would invite comment from everyone who's been here today to follow up, please, on those topics. But thank you all for coming.
Thanks, Commissioner Christie. Commissioner Phillips? No? Okay. John, did you want to?
Thank you all for coming and chatting with us. It's been great.
Thanks a lot.